You train. Down this time, every now and then we'll make a weird
But you don't think your computer is
well, I wonder if it's
wheel or
it sounds like a weird wheel.
Yeah, that was really weird. The timing.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Andrew, all good?
Yep, oh, yeah.
Great. I'll be up in a minute.
Okay, we think we have enough.
I heard it twice and then I didn't hear it.
I'm looking at the screen on my phone.
Hi, Margaret.
Oh, are you cold? No, I'm actually warm. Oh, do you want it on then? Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. But now I get cold. Okay, so I've done this socialization training talk here a couple of times, but we wanted to make sure to get it videoed for the levels stuff, trainer levels, so we're doing it again. It's okay, it's one of my absolute favorite topics in the world. Just curious how many of you have seen me give this presentation before? A few of you. Okay, well, I hope it's not too terribly redundant. I'm always looking for new videos and pictures to put in, but you know, I guess if it's too boring, then I'll know which of you have seen it before. And so feel free to nap or whatever. All right, so what we want to talk about is socialization training, and really what we need. Mouse issues. So really what we want to focus on are what we call socialization objectives. So what do we want to achieve with socialization training? First is we want to meet the social needs of all members of the group. And by this we mean if you have a social group of animals, they're supposed to be social, you want appropriate species typical kinds of interactions going on. So not excessive levels of aggression, not excessive levels of affiliation, which does happen, I'll touch on that a little bit, some abnormal levels of these social behaviors. We know somebody's going to be dominant, we know somebody's going to be subordinate, so we're not trying to take that away, but just to create as much normal social behavior as possible. So aggression, we know it's going to happen. We know captivity often heightens levels and frequency of aggression. So we may want to reduce aggression to more acceptable levels, but we're not really looking to completely eliminate it because it certainly is a part of most social animals' repertoire. We may want to increase some affiliative behaviors. Say you've got animals that live in a social group but don't really interact very much with each other. Maybe they don't aggress, maybe they don't affiliate, they just sort of share the same space. So we can actually teach them to do normal pro-social kinds of behaviors as well. And then from the management accessing animals perspective, it's typically easiest to, do a physical exam or look at or somehow interact with the more dominant or bolder animals of the group because they're willing to approach. And typically the really subordinate or shyer animals may not feel confident enough to approach the person because they might get attacked by the more dominant animals. So from a management perspective, we want to be able to access everybody because you can't just do physical checks on the bold dominant animals. You need to see how the subordinates are doing as well. So we know captivity can kind of intensify our social problems and create some challenges. We may have animals, particularly rescue animals or animals that have been hand-raised or somehow not reared in an appropriate social upbringing when they were just, infants or just maturing. They may have poor social skills. They may be overall socially incompetent or those sorts of things. we may have males that are hyper-aggressive to females, females that are very fearful of males, things like that. Oftentimes we do have excessive levels of aggression. With some primates, you may have females that have these really strong matrilineals, and it can be extremely difficult to get matrilineals to go together because they have such strong dominance hierarchies. And introductions, when you have animals that you're not quite sure about how they're going to react in a social situation, or you get an animal that has a reputation of being really aggressive from another zoo, then that can make introductions really scary. And of course, if we're not willing to sort of take that risk to introduce animals to each other, then we're really not fulfilling that socialization part of their life that's so important and they really need. And of course, the limited space of captivity, the confinement of captivity can certainly exacerbate these problems. So it's not easy finding a friend. Sometimes when you have an animal that is highly social and you feel like really wants to interact, they may have to, you may have to work really hard to find an appropriate friend for them. I like this video. This is at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Bastrop, Texas. They have a bunch of chimpanzee corrals. So there's all these corrals that are lined up, 2 rows, 8 of them. And if you can see, this guy is standing up on a tall pole. Oops, I'm going to swell. That guy's standing up on a tall pole, and up over here, there's other chimps that are up on their poles. So they can all kind of stand there and look at each other. And when you have a situation where you have hundreds of individuals of a species, if you two don't get along, well then maybe I can try you two or pick somebody from over here. So you have lots of options. In zoos, typically, we don't have those options. Kind of labs and sanctuaries may have multiple individuals of a particular species or mixed species opportunities, but zoos, we may get those 2 animals and they're supposed to get along, and that isn't always so easy. So sometimes you have animals with very special needs. This elephant, both of her right feet had been broken, and she was quite compromised with her movement. She really couldn't locomote quickly, and she could easily fall over. So she was being assessed to move from this sanctuary, which is in East Texas, to another sanctuary either in Tennessee or California. And ultimately it was decided that she couldn't navigate the terrain in either of those other elephant sanctuaries where she could have elephant companionship. So she is, a female elephant. In the wild, they're really never alone. They're always with family or friends or somebody. So here she was living in this very abnormal social situation. Oh, sounds unconnected. So she had Omar, the camel, was her friend. And you can see they're not housed in the same enclosure, but they do have quite good access to each other. She would sort of groom and stroke Omar, and he would nuzzle and nibble on her a little bit. So, I think that the lesson of this is socialization is important. Species are designed to socialize. What's the worst thing that we do to a human as punishment? Yeah, solitary confinement, go in the cell block by yourself. That's the worst thing you can do to a person. That's what, other than like torture. But, so I think, we have to think about how even though an animal may have lived alone, Babe lived without other elephants for many, many years, and staff even said, oh, well, she didn't really get along with the other elephants all that well. That doesn't mean that she never wants to have another friend. So if you work with an animal who's particularly challenging, difficult to socialize, aggressive, that doesn't mean that they don't have that need. Perhaps they just don't know how to behave appropriately, and maybe we haven't gotten quite creative enough in finding a solution to fulfill their social needs. The 2 monkeys up at the top right, one of them is still here, that's a Shia in the basket. And she was housed with an ancient Diana monkey because they were both solitary animals, and so the Diana monkey was brought from a zoo in Oklahoma to Oakland to socialize both of them. And they groomed each other. I have some photos of it every now and again, but from the people who actually took care of them, they didn't really socialize a whole lot, but at least they did have each other, and you could see them kind of moving around, and you know, they knew they were with each other. And perhaps we could have done more to encourage them to socialize, but I don't think that the Diana monkey lived but a couple of years here, and that she was ancient when she came here. So anyway, yeah, we just, you know, I think that we never should kind of give up on providing animals with social opportunities, because it is so important for their welfare. So we have to get creative, we have to think outside the box. We may have, you know, grizzly bears, not normally super social year-round in the wild. There may be times where they come together and gather in groups, but they certainly don't live together 12 months out of the year. But we know in captivity, oftentimes they can be housed socially 12 months out of the year. Same with orangutans, typically, you know, solitary in the wild, but in captivity we know that they can live in groups. So we really need to be creative and think about how we fulfill the behavioral and psychological needs of these animals. Okay, so tools that we use to enhance socialization. I mean, we know about targeting to move animals and get different body parts, but we can also think of targeting as a tool to enhance socialization. If we teach animals to come, I forgot my water, to go to, come, stay at targets, then we have a lot better ways of manipulating their social behavior, stationing the dominant animals, positioning the dominant animals so that the subordinate animals feel more comfortable approaching, and all those sorts of things. So teaching animals to station can be really helpful. And another way that we have on occasion used the station behavior is during introductions. So if you're introducing animals, maybe they're not super socially competent, they've been hand raised or whatever their situation might be, when you teach station and you get it as a really strong behavior during an introduction or during times when things start to elevate a little bit in the social group, you can actually send them to their station and let them relax a little bit. Of course, you're reinforcing them for going to the station and making that choice to go have a bit of a rest, a break from the rigors of social housing, social behavior, and get reinforcement for that. Of course, we can also use stationing when we're actually working with groups of animals by teaching them to stay on a station. The benturongs, and anything can be a target, anything can be a station. So the lemurs here at Oakland Zoo have the little platforms as well as the balls are their station. The benturongs on your right, the milk crates are the station. They don't have to sit on them, they don't have to stand on them like a T-stand or anything like that. They just have to generally be near that station target. And then that allows one trainer to work with multiple animals. This is, we were just talking about this chimpanzee. This is Lulu. At this point, she's now 55 or 56 years old. She's had 2 strokes, a bit more compromised than she was in this video, but she still is the boss of the male midge. It's just the 2 of them together now. When this video was made, there were 3 of them. But you see the blue barrel, that's kind of a visual barrier and also serves as a Lulu, don't go past this point barrier, so a bit of a point of reference as well as a visual barrier to make midge feel more comfortable. So the idea is one person's working and says, Lulu, stay, and I'm going to go do something with midge and then come back and reinforce you. So it's just an example of one person working with multiple animals. And you can see he's quite a distance away. That's about how close he felt comfortable. He was too nervous moving closer to her at this point.
Lulu, stay. Good girl, you get 2. Good girl.
Gotta pay the boss. Okay, you can also use a feature in the enclosure as a station. Doesn't have to be something that you go and put in there. You may just have a feature like rocks. And you teach the animal to go to a particular location in the enclosure. It's nice if it's something that looks really obvious and conspicuous like the rocks. So you send this elephant to the rocks and she stays there. Okay, this is an example I was talking about using the stations as the cool down. This is at a rescue center in the Philippines, and these monkeys come out of the pet trade, or they're bar monkeys, or they get kicked by people if they're tamed outside on a sidewalk, that sort of thing. So when they arrive to the rescue center, you can imagine they're not particularly keen on people. They don't know how to be monkeys, so we do a lot of work to integrate them into social groups. Some of the groups will actually be released into the forest, because the rescue center is in the middle of quite a nice forest. So they'll be released into a forest if a nice stable group can be formed, and it appears that they would be a group that could survive with release. But one of the first things that we do is start to socialize them, get them behaving as normally as possible. And during those introduction periods, it can be pretty tense. And so one of the things that we use is the cool down station. And with a lot of animals that need to reconcile, they may have a bit of a scuffle, and then that reconciliation period is really important. And if you interrupt the aggression before they get to reconcile and never give them the opportunity for reconciliation, it can really screw things up. So although this sounds simple, oh yeah, just go to your station and everybody relax, this is actually pretty advanced technique and requires a sophisticated understanding of the species behavior as well as the individuals. Because if you are going to interrupt and say, everybody go to your stations and relax, you want to make sure that you do it before they get so far that they can't, because they've already launched into heightened level of aggression. So you have to catch them before they go there, but not so soon that you don't give them the chance to reconcile. So it is a very, I think it's a sophisticated technique, but it's also an extremely helpful technique. There was actually a paper published, or it was a presentation, I think, with a paper a number of years ago, 25 years ago, of using this technique when I was working with active environments and Gail Lawley did the project. And so it's published by Active Environments, and it was presented by Toledo Zoo, sorry, had a brain cramp there. And it was using this exact technique for gorilla introductions. I think it was presented at AZAC eons ago. So anyway, I think it is a sophisticated technique that can be really helpful.
Margaret, if you send them before they reconcile because of the timing, then you do reconciliation after. You say go and then come back. That'd be nice.
Well, I mean, reconciliation kind of requires a bit of aggression in a fight. Otherwise, we don't have anything to reconcile.
No, but
so
like
if
you
they're
catch it
starting
at the
to
wrong
get,
time, you know?
yeah, I mean, ideally you would sort of go whoop and let them back together.
Okay.
The risk is then they would have to kind of fight again in order to have something to reconcile.
So if you break it, they won't come back and do like the grooming afterwards or something like that. It's more like it has to flow right into it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I think that's more common. I mean, not that what you're describing, any of that could happen, but it is a risk that if you do interrupt them and they don't come back to it, and then they stay like, I'm still kind of mad at you, and we haven't, and maybe they don't really know how to reconcile all that well. I mean, a lot of times you're talking about animals who are quite socially incompetent and don't know what to do. I think if they have a better understanding of species appropriate behavior, and at least if one of them does, then the situation you're describing would be more likely to happen.
Okay.
But if they're both like,
Right, and they don't know how to go back and be like, hey, remember earlier?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So, when we're talking about everybody getting along, certainly fear plays a big role in that. If you are working with social groups of animals, you know, somebody's gonna be dominant, somebody's gonna be subordinate, and oftentimes that subordinate animal can, and, you know, with good justification, become quite fearful of the dominant animal. If they're getting chased a lot, if they're getting displaced a lot, then they just sort of go into this mode of, I'm always scared, and they're the cat running from the dog. So I think we do have to think about fear and aggression as being intimately tied together as it relates to social behavior. So, you know, there's, again, this is sort of some information from different studies on aggression, but we know aggression occurs for a number of different reasons. But when we're thinking about social behavior and how aggression can be reinforced, if a dominant animal learns to displace the subordinate and gain something from that experience, then that behavior is reinforced. What the dominant animal could gain would be food or resources, attention from a keeper, access to an enrichment device, or just the thrill of displacing somebody else. You know, that can be pretty reinforcing too. So sometimes we do have to think of aggression as a reinforced and modified behavior. And when you're the dominant animal and you displace somebody and get something for it, then you've satisfied some want or need. So it's even further reinforced, perhaps outside the scope of just accessing that thing. Especially if it's in a situation of establishing or changing dominance or hierarchy where there's, you know, some up and down and fighting for dominance. All right, so we know that certain conditions that lead to aggression may include things like protecting yourself, protecting your territory, protecting offspring, or protecting resources that are valuable to you. But again, when we're talking about fear, we want to think about what sorts of aggression can emerge from fear-induced or fear-related behaviors. So as you're looking at social behaviors, are animals defending a territory? Are they doing things that are species appropriate and normal? Or are they sort of acting outside the scope of what you would think of as kind of normal social behavior, normal aggressive behavior? So when we think about fear-related social behavior, think about desensitization. We know desensitization is a tool that we use to train out fear. Most often we think of it in use with husbandry, veterinary types of behaviors. But remember, this is just a technique of training out fear of anything. And that can include fear of another animal. Okay, other times where you might have intensified social interactions or encounters would include things like shifting, because you're often asking animals to go from a larger space through a narrow door and perhaps into a smaller space. If you're shifting from a large exhibit into a holding area, you might be asking them to go funnel through a narrow doorway and then into a smaller space. So that can be a time where heightened aggression can happen. But of course, we have to do these things. They're needed for daily husbandry and care. So anyway, there are a lot of consequences to our daily husbandry routines that we need to think about and how those can affect social behavior. And then how we might think, oh, let's just separate them because then they don't have to worry about isolation. I mean, they don't have to worry about being together, so it's almost easier if we just separate them. Well, maybe not. Yes, they don't have to worry about getting pushed and shoved around, but being alone is, again, could be considered a punishment for an animal, but it's also scary, even though I want to be with you. Being alone is, I mean, I want to be with you, but it's scary being with you, but being alone might actually be worse. So, shifting, going through small spaces, socializing, these are all important aspects of husbandry. Isolation, it's also an important aspect of husbandry because there are times when we have to isolate animals. So all of these things that we do, sometimes on a daily basis, but at least in response for veterinary care or procedures, they all can intensify our problems with social behavior. So I just throw all of that out there for you to think about when you're observing social interactions and thinking about the times when it's worse or better and how your daily routines might affect those things. So just to consider isolation a little bit, you can certainly train animals to be separated. If, well, we were just talking about it with the lemurs the other day, you oftentimes if you're going to do an anesthesia on an animal, you may need to isolate it from the group, and so that can be stressful. If they're a happy social group, you need to train separation, social separation, and isolation in preparation for an anesthetic event or something like that. But we can use socialization training, we can use separation training to offer a bit of a break from the rigors of social housing if the training is done in a step-by-step way that the animals can learn to tolerate. Some of these things are specific, like the voluntary separation. If you have animals that are trained to voluntarily separate and they're calm and relaxed when they separate, oftentimes putting them back together can be calmer. And to me, I really think of this example with a group of chimpanzees that I used to work with. It was a group of 18, and they were mostly hand raised, so they were a bit off anyhow. And every time we would separate, because I was the only trainer for this group of 18 animals, so I would create subgroups so that I could have fewer than 18 at once. And every time I would put them back together, it was almost like the first time they'd been introduced. It was chaos and chimpanzee mayhem and fingers getting bit and things like that. So we, pretty quickly recognized this isn't so great for the animals. We need to create a situation where we can separate them but also put them back together in a reasonable way. And part of that was not being so opportunistic about the separation. So, oh, this group's over here, this group's over here, shut the door. And then go to your training session, because they weren't quite expecting it. So we had to get really methodical about how we separated the groups, and then again, they could be calm when they were separated because they were accustomed to it. Separation didn't always mean bad things, and then they were much calmer going back together, and we were able to increase the time that they were separated. So that's a pretty specific thing, but when I think about it, voluntary separations make calmer reintroductions, but you may have some examples of that as well. All right. I feel like I'm talking really fast because I kind of wanted to get through all this introductory material so that we can start to get to the more fun technique part of it. So, sorry. Okay. Any questions so far? I'll try to slow down. All right. So this is showing you, and again, some of you may have seen these series of video clips before, but this is a different group of chimps, same facility. These chimpanzees needed to be trained for separation. The focus of the training is a mother and daughter. The mother is Ursula, the daughter is Misty. And when I say mother and daughter, it's not, a tiny little infant that Ursula's holding to her chest. Ursula is the mom. She's in her 40s. Misty, the daughter, is 28. And the problem is Ursula will not let Misty be separated from her. Misty doesn't really seem to care. So Ursula's really the focus of the training. And what we did was, well, you'll see there's 2 trainers. There's a group of, I think the total group is maybe 7 or 8 individuals, including Misty and Ursula. And we don't really care where they go, because again, the focus was Misty and Ursula. So the first step in the training is to station each. This is Misty, and you can see she's holding on to her PVC target. And then Ursula is actually stationed right here. And you'll see the trainers are also juicing the other animals as well. There's 2 dens. So there's 2 dens, and stop for a minute. Let's see. Oh well. 2 dens, a slider in between the 2 dens, and then also, if you could see like where Misty was, so there's the 2 dens, and then it kind of L'd out this way. So Ursula's down here, and she can see. She can see exactly what's happening. And just like everything else, the separation is voluntary. We know Ursula's the focus of it. She doesn't want the separation to happen, so we want her to see every step of the way. So it was really nice that she could be stationed on that little L sticking out there, because she could see all the doors being shut, and she could see where Misty was. So Misty's stationed over here, there's a slider in between, Ursula's stationed here, and there's also 2 doors that go to the outdoor corral. So the first thing was to close the 2 doors to the outdoor corral, and then to begin desensitization to the slider. Good to know. The down has plummeted. All right. Okay, and then what we do is have Ursula's trainer, the mom. Her trainer is going to begin to desensitize Ursula to him going over to that slider door. So you'll see he's going to ask her to stay and just take 1 step away. Really simple, very small, literal step, but step in the shaping process. Then he starts to move a little bit further away, but he's still got all his eyes and attention on Ursula. And now notice how his body position is beginning to change a little bit, and he's adjusting the bridge. At first it was Ursula, stay, and then he gives her something, stay, bridging for each little step, and he's watching her. So now watch how the bridge is beginning to be adjusted. And then once Ursula is comfortable with him walking over towards the door, you saw he just touched the door and rattled it a little bit there. Now he'll start some slight door movement. And again, watch how much his body position and orientation towards her has changed. And then gradually, this training was done over the course of about 10 days. And so you can see the progress that they're making. Now it's up to moving the door about 3/4 of the way. And now you'll see he's really just turning and walking away at a much more normal pace, because she's gotten so comfortable that he can walk over, close the door, and actually lock it closed. Okay, so again, that just sort of shows you some of the steps that were involved for these 2 chimpanzees. And again, we didn't care about the rest of the group. They weren't the focus. The attention was really on Misty and Ursula, because they were the problems. Before they were trained for separation, when we did anesthesia on them, 2 of us were there, we each had chimp, we're like, okay, ready, 1, 2, 3, boom. And we would inject them at the same time so that they would go down together, because they weren't trained for socialization. They were great with injections, but not did I say socialization? Separation. They weren't trained for separation. We knew that if we separated them through force or coercion or trickery, that they wouldn't participate in the voluntary injection. So in that case, we decided, let's just inject them at the same time. It's likely they'll go down pretty close at the same time and not hurt each other if, one would be sleeping before the other. But really, for the safest anesthesia, you want to have the animals separated. Okay, so then really moving into, I think, the more critical elements of socialization training, one of the most important techniques that you should learn to use if you're not already is called cooperative feeding. And cooperative feeding doesn't just mean giving animals food together. Cooperative feeding is a specific training technique, and it's been used on a number of different species, from hoofstock to carnivores to primates. Pretty much anybody that's social can learn to kind of think about cooperative feeding and respond to it really well. So cooperative feeding, first off, it involves that you know what species appropriate behavior is. So you have to know what affiliative behavior is, you have to know what aggressive behavior is, you may need to know the individual's nuances, so you have to know the animals really well. Social behavior can often be really subtle. It may be just a little show of a tooth or a flash of an eyelid or whatever, a flick of a tail, whatever it might be. And sometimes those subtleties are lost on the stupid humans. So it really does require that you look very carefully at the animals and really learn all about them. And then what you're going to do is very carefully reinforce positive social behavior. And I already said that. That's why I like to put everything up. I need to just change it. We are not trying to eliminate dominance. We are, in fact, recognizing that an animal's dominant, and we're reinforcing them for being an appropriate dominant, not for being a bully or hyper-aggressive or anything like that. And when you implement cooperative feeding, what happens is dominant animals they're reinforced for letting subordinates have food or attention or whatever it is that they want. So the dominants get reinforced, and I'll show you how it works in just a sec. And the subordinates are given something, but then the dominants are reinforced for letting that happen. And what happens over time is the dominants become much more patient and tolerant of the subordinates having access to resources or receiving treats or food or something like that. So the dominants become more patient and tolerant, and the subordinates kind of get braver because they're not getting chased and attacked all the time. And it goes, well, we were talking about with giraffe earlier, with kind of the dog or the cat who runs from the dog gets chased more. So the animal, the subordinate who's always like, oh, are you gonna come get me, or are you gonna come get me, and is always ready to run, almost makes the dominant focus their attention more on that individual, because now they're a target, like, oh, if you're really scared of me, I'm gonna keep my eye on you. So if you can get everybody to calm down a little bit, then there's more social cohesion, I think, less chasing. So the way that, let me go talk about this. All right, so sneaking food. What I mean by sneaking food is if you have your dominant and your subordinate, you really want to get that poor little subordinate some food. So you toss the food, the dominant runs to get it, and then here, subordinate, have this, have this, have this. So that's what I mean by sneaking food, is distracting the dominant and then trying to sneak something to the subordinate. And I mean, I've certainly tried this technique before I knew about cooperative feeding, and I think overall it's counterproductive because really, maybe with the exception of a few exhibits, it's pretty easy for a dominant animal to have an eye or an ear or a smell on everything that's going on. I mean, and then they almost become more vigilant because they discover that you're trying to sneak food to the subordinate. And so now they're really, really watching. They're almost hyper vigilant about the situation. So it can really be counterproductive if you're trying to sneak food rather than use cooperative feeding. Okay, so with cooperative feeding, I'm ill-prepared and then I don't have any. Is there any? No. What can we use? Do we have any snacks?
Goldfish?
Oh, they're these little cheese things, they're taking it.
All right, we'll just pretend.
Oh, there's goldfish.
Goldfish, all right. Thank you.
Either late bloomers or early bloomers, if they don't get it the next day.
All right. We have a few of those french fries. Were you done with them?
She's really just hungry, that's all.
Okay.
That's all I'm doing.
Let's see, okay, so we'll use you. You already have some french fries, but pretend you have it. Okay, you're gonna be dominant. Know your subject, right? You're gonna be subordinate. Of these lovely french fries and the goldfish, which is your favorite?
I'm feeling goldfish today.
Goldfish, okay. So because this really is all about the dominant animal letting the subordinate have something. Goldfish are the dominant's favorite. Kind of used. French fries are not your favorite today. So if I want my dominant to succeed, I wouldn't go and offer goldfish to the subordinate, because then you're gonna be like, that's my goldfish, those are my favorite, I want them. So I'm gonna start by giving the subordinate something that's a little less desirable. And I'm gonna pick a small one to start with, because I want to be successful. So I'm going to call up my dominant. Come here, good girl. There's your treat for coming and sitting and staying. And then now I start the cooperative feeding. So the cooperative feeding is I give the subordinate something. Good girl. Now you're gonna get 2 or 3 of your favorite. So the bridge happens when I give food to the subordinate. It feels like I'm bridging because I'm giving food to the subordinate. It feels like I'm bridging the subordinate, but the bridge is really for you. And the way that you work it, you can let the dominant know that it really is all about them. So the way I do that is I've got my attention on you, I'm giving you the food, I'm not, good girl. So you know it's all about you, even though she's getting the food in the moment. So that's kind of how it looks. That's how you execute cooperative feeding. And then over time, I would want to equalize the food a little bit. So maybe I would have more choices. Maybe I would give you 1 goldfish and I'm going to give you a handful. I mean, I don't want to make my dominance big and fat by giving them super treats all the time. So at some point you have to kind of equalize the amount of food you're giving. But when you start, you're going to skew it, just so you can really let that dominant know, thank you so much for letting this poor little subordinate have that nasty old french fry. Okay, so that's kind of the way it works out. Feel free to enjoy those.
Thank you. Have you had your subordinates turning down the french fries before?
Yes, I'll show you some video. Okay, oh, and then the other thing I guess I should say is if you're working with a bigger group of animals, so now you've got 2 or 3 animals, I would suggest that you start with your dominant and then your next in line. So if you're the least dominant, I don't want to start with you 2, because she's going to be much more, ooh, something weird just happened in my ears. She's going to be much more likely to chase you than you. So I would start here, where my dominant can learn about this cooperative feeding thing. And then I would move it to my more subordinate, more subordinate, more subordinate. So you slowly add those guys in.
I just have a question. It's kind of similar to Amber's, but have you ever seen where the subordinate is really wants the goldfish and not giving them the goldfish creates kind of a anxiety?
Not really, and I mean, if I was having trouble finding something, I guess, usually the subordinates are, you can find something that they want to take.
Well, yeah,
And
they
still
might
have
take it.
something better for
Okay.
the dominance. So I think the discussion then becomes, are they not taking it because they don't like the food, or are they not taking it because they're too scared? And so how do you manage that?
I think very exactly the same setup. We're feeding the macaws, trying to do that same thing with peanut pieces, little bits for the dominant bird, and then sunflowers for the subordinate, which works out well because they like both. However, after a couple of reinforcements, the more subordinate bird will occasionally do a finger lunge sometimes because they can see that you're feeding the other bird the peanuts,
Mm.
and they definitely want peanuts, so they won't aggress at the other bird, but they'll aggress at the feeder.
Ah, okay. So have you moved to giving them a small piece of peanut and then still keeping a bigger piece or 2 pieces for the dominant?
Yeah, and we've done that as well
Yeah.
too.
So you're starting to
some option.
equalize, yeah, you're starting to equalize the value of the reinforcement a little bit, yeah. And yeah, like I said, you do want to begin to equalize it. Usually we start off by giving the dominant something really good and bringing that down, but you're just kind of describing like, we're gonna give the dominant some good stuff and bring the subordinate up. So it's kind of the same thing, just working it from this end to this end, or, you know, like that. So yeah, and you can always use 2 or 3 pieces for the dominant, so you can give 1 small piece to the subordinate. And really I'll show you some videos here in a sec. That's probably the next video coming out. Nope, I'm wrong. It's a group of chimpanzees, and it was one of the first groups, again, at MD Anderson, one of the first groups that was really worked with this technique. The technique was actually developed by when working with adult male California sea lions who go into rut, in the summer, and all the big boys that you want to use in a show are trying to fight with each other on stage, and so that's where this technique was kind of born, was working with adult male sea lions who were trying to kill each other on stage. But it was applied to this group of chimpanzees, and after a period of a few months of training, the cooperative feeding was maintained with an extra quarter of an apple. So that's all that the dominant male would get that was above and beyond what everybody else was getting, was a quarter of an apple. So it really equalized the amount of food. But that was significant to him, worked for him. So here are some Mona monkeys. First time they are being cooperatively fed. Clyde is the male on the right, Bonnie is the female. And there's actually a third animal, she's sitting right here. See her little arm? She's sitting there, she's very, very subordinate, and she's not willing to approach. But this is the first time that they've ever been cooperatively fed. So you'll see Clyde is sort of aggressive about trying to steal the food. Fortunately, Bonnie's pretty brave. She comes back up. And a click is being used as the bridge. So there was the click. And you can see he did a little bit of chasing, but nothing compared to that first time. And they're a really half-hearted attempt. And we do want the dominant animal to see the subordinate getting the food. And he looked right at her when she got the food, and he chose to stay. So he's getting kind of a nice jackpot there. Okay, here's the group of chimps. So this is...
Real quick, when he first did the chasing of her, did they call him back?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and in that case, he did, I'm glad you said that actually. So he chased her, he got on top of her. He may have gotten her food, or she may have eaten at that point. But yeah, just call him back. That's the first time that he's ever seen this happen. So we kind of ignore it. We're not going to give him a timeout or anything, because he doesn't understand what he's supposed to do. But simply by managing how you give the food a little bit, knowing the individuals, you could see how quickly, and you were almost watching real time in the video there, how quickly that happened. You can kind of manage the dominant animal's behavior and get a sense of what they're going to do. I remember when one of the workshops that we did here years ago, the old group of baboons, we did some cooperative feeding with the adult male, and I think it was the old male that was also with the group. So Raffi was the dominant male, Gordon was the older guy, and Raffi learned the cooperative feeding so fast. Gail and I were practicing it before we taught the workshop because we wanted to use them for an example. And we're like, oh crap, they're learning it so fast, we need to stop what we're doing because we want to show it in progress for the workshop, because they learned it like this, once you kind of get the timing down and figure out how to give the food to the subordinate and when you need to reinforce and give the food to the dominant, they learn it super fast. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is when you're doing cooperative feeding, if the dominant scares the subordinate and they spit out the food or they drop it or whatever it might be, the dominant may get that one piece of food from the subordinate, but what they learn is, oh, if I stay here, I get 3 goldfish instead of 1 yucky French fry. So they learn what their choices are. I can chase you, and maybe I get your 1 nasty old French fry, but if I choose to stay here, I get a handful of goldfish. So now it's worth my while to sit here and get those goldfish. Okay, so this is before cooperative feeding. Animals are fed from above, which is particularly difficult with high-value food items because you're just chucking food in at them, so it's super easy for the dominant animal to manage everybody in the group just by looking at them or doing a little charge towards them. And that's Pug walking with all the food in his hands. There were 2 other males in the group and then a bunch of females. And Rosalind up there, she was the one who would reliably get something because she was up high and you could chuck it to her. So there's just a lot of chaos. You can't probably, I don't know why it's not coming off the TV. But you know, a lot of chasing, a lot of chaos. Hard for everybody to get their fair share. So this is into the training just a little bit. And what we did was inside those same dens that you saw Misty and Ursula being separated in, we brought Pug inside, taught him to sit and stay, and then transferred the sit and stay to outside. So now we have a way to position him, reinforce him for sitting and staying, and then start giving food. 1 for somebody else, bridge and reinforce Pug. 2, bridge and reinforce Pug. 3, until eventually you can feed the whole group and bridge and reinforce Pug. So this is a little bit into the training, and I love his behavior is so telling. So this is him right here. He's like, I'm staying, doing it, I'm watching them get fed, food's flying over his head. Scratching is a nervous thing for chimps. So he's a little apprehensive. I'm still sitting. Still sitting. Really scooting a little, but still sitting. And there's his carrot, which he ignores, and his apple. And at this point, he's still getting a whole apple. So he sat and waited for everybody else to get their food until he could get his apple.
And he was the only one who got the
And he was the only one who got the apple. So he's, you know, we're saying, Pug, you're special, you're dominant, we're going to make you feel special as long as you're not a jerk about it. You know, and that's the whole idea is, you're dominant. We recognize your dominance and we're going to pay you for being a nice dominant, but not for being a bully. So this is about, I think the pre-video was spring of 1991, summer of 91. This is January of 92. And the interesting thing is, so this is Pug right here. Nobody else was taught to sit. But look at how different it looks from the first video clip, where everybody's milling around and kind of running around. And what happened is, the more dominant animals, or the animals that were, and for those of you who know chimps, this won't be a surprise, the ones who were seeking Pug's partnership would sit close to him. So the more dominant animals got to sit close to Pug. But they chose that on their own. That was all up to them. So, like I said, he's the only one who was taught to sit and stay. But now, even like a desirable thing like frozen yogurt or something like that could be fed out, whereas before it just would have caused mayhem.
I have a question. Did you see any increase in Pug's stereotypy, like all those behaviors he was offering at first?
No.
Okay.
No, you mean when he was anxious?
Yeah, all those
No,
little
that
things.
went away. He
Okay.
would just, because then he started, the more proficient he got and his understanding of what was happening deepened, then he calmed down.
Got it.
And everybody calmed down. I mean, you can see like now the whole group's just, we're all just coming here and taking up a seat at the dinner table to get ready for food. Yeah. And no matter what, Pug died a few years ago, but no matter what group he was in, he was always dominant, and he was always fed in a cooperative feed manner, and the behavior maintained until he was, I think he died dominant, actually. So. Do you remember this? So when I think Liz was out, Myra was managing this group of crazy otters with babies and mayhem and chaos and otter activity everywhere. And shark teeth. And it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was kind of challenging to get everybody a bit of food. Was it the young male?
We all,
Yeah, that was really pushy. So this is kind of before we really did too much cooperative feeding. A little bit of kind of just mayhem. And then when we started the cooperative feeding, I don't know them until the video starts. But I hope you'll be able to tell who's dominant. If not, Myra will help us. So subordinate, dominant gets bridged and reinforced. So even for something kind of as spastic, active as an otter, this technique can be applied. And I mean, I think we just did it over 1 or 2 sessions, right? And it seemed to make a difference really fast.
Yeah, we started with just 2, so one otter with him and then increased to.
We added in the others,
Yeah,
right?
pretty
Those sisters
quickly.
or something, yeah. And am I just pie in the sky remembering it, or I
No,
feel
no,
like
you're
they
right.
learned it really
It's very
fast.
fast.
Okay. And sometimes I'm just all sunshine and bunny rabbits.
No, it was very.
Okay. So yeah, that was really cool to see how fast it worked, even for, you know, something like an otter. But this is where it comes back to whoever's question about what if somebody doesn't take the food. Was that your question? Yeah. So finding the starting point. Where do you start with this? You may not be able to, one person walk up and start doing your cooperative feeding with 2 animals. You may need 1 person per animal. You may need 1 person with the dominant, while somebody else manages the subordinates, depending on the group size. You may need to put a big distance between the animals and then try to gradually bring them together. You may want to look at enclosure features that you can use to kind of help everybody feel a little more comfortable with the situation. So you have to look and see what's happening, what the enclosure offers you, how the animals are behaving, and then determine your starting point from that. So again, you may be able to start with 1 trainer, 2 animals. Oops. You may have to start with multiple trainers. Trainer on the right is working with the dominant animal. And I think you'll see, if I have the right video, you'll see the subordinate trainer back out and just turn it over to the dominant trainer. So even though they're 2 people, they feed as if they're 1 using that same technique I showed you. So give the subordinate food, bridge and reinforce the dominant. Subordinate gets food, bridge and reinforce dominant. So they're still acting and bridging and training in the same manner as if they were 1 person. So you can see the dominant trainer stays right with the dominant animal. Dominant's watching what's happening, knows what's going on, but they were able to move to just 1 trainer. Okay, so that's one example of where you could start. This is in a lab situation. These 2 macaques you'll see have a pretty strong dominance hierarchy. And the dominant is such a strong, aggressive dominant that they had to start with 2 people. So you'll see the whole process of going through, trying to start with 1 person, asking 1 animal to come over to one side of the cage. Obviously a really confined space, very easy for the dominant to control and beat up the subordinate. Okay, so now going to 2 people, dominant's on your right. And at first the subordinate trainer's just gonna lift her hand. She's not even giving food. and reinforcing the dominant for not making a move when the subordinate trainer, the one in the pink, lifts her hand. So the dominant is so busy guarding that it's really hard to get that bridge in. So they ask, and you also can't look at the monkeys because then they get all aggressive and kooky. Now they've switched sides. The dominant is on the left, the subordinate's on the right. And you can see now the subordinate is all up in the top of the cage. The dominant's at least more or less staying on her side. So you can see now they're at least able to get a bit of food to the subordinate, although I wouldn't call her relaxed. Okay, dominant is still on your left. And now you can see the subordinate's actually coming down and sitting on the cage floor in a little bit more relaxed way. Okay, and now moving to one person. Subordinate's on your right. And she's just going to move her hand, bridge and reinforce. So she's making it easier on the dominant when she goes from 2 people to 1 person. But you'll see quickly now she's going to start to offer a little food. Okay, so I think it's a really, it's obviously in a lab example, a lot of confinement there. But it's a really nice example of a starting point, just turned away from the monkey, lifting your hand, bridging and reinforcing the dominant for letting that happen, all the way through the steps of moving to 1 person, being able to feed both of these animals. So great, great progress, good example there. Okay, I like to call this giving is more important than taking. So for this case, this is 2 gibbons. The young male is down here on the ground. The adult female is up here. She's very dominant to him. He's quite young. You'll see in the video. He kind of looks like a little baby. And he's not even brave enough to take the food. And the staffing situation was such that they didn't feel like they would be able to have 2 people to come over and put enough distance between them. So our starting point for this was drop the food in. We don't care what he does with it. This is not about him taking the food right now. This is about her not stealing the food when we drop it in. So that was the only objective, was to drop the food in, bridge and reinforce her for letting that happen. And then eventually he'll get brave enough that he'll take the food. So again, doesn't matter what he does, the point is drop the food in, bridge and reinforce her. And he knows it's there, he wants to take it. Look at his little face. Then again, another thing that can help you with your starting point is looking at different enclosure features that you might have. In this case, there was a nice corner to work with. So the dominant lion is on your right. The subordinate is the one that's being targeted right there. This trainer is just learning to do cooperative feeding. It's her first time to ever hear about it, think about it, and then actually do it. So I think her bridge is a little bit late, maybe because in the example when we say we're like, give the dominant something, bridge and reinforce give the subordinate something, bridge and reinforce the dominant. So you'll see her intention. She's very intentional in what she's doing, but she is just a little bit late, but it's still a nice example. There's also, you hear a couple of targets. There's somebody else doing one down, or working with another line off to the right. And it's okay when you're doing this to throw in a couple of other behaviors. With the dominant, you can see she's obviously asking for up and some targets in there, just kind of mixing it up. But then the idea is when you do anything with the subordinate, you're going to make sure and bridge and reinforce the dominant. But you have a little more time to work with the dominant because the subordinate's not likely to come displace them. Another example of using a corner. So this is a dominant female drill and a young subordinate male. So again, the female is asked to sit and stay first. So she asks the female to stay, gives the male a little something, goes back to the female, bridges and reinforces her. Baboons here inside the baboon night house. The male inside the tube is dominant, trying to get an opportunity to do a little targeting with the female, but he keeps reaching up even though he's in this nice little cylinder tube. So she's too scared to even touch the target, even though she knows how to do it. So what we're going to do is ask him to sit and stay, reinforce him for doing that, so he knows he's still part of the game. And while he's had a bit of reinforcement, it's much easier to work with her. And then immediately he gets something. You can also use cooperative feeding when the door is actually closed or when there's a physical barrier between the animals. And if you're doing an introduction, animals have never been together before, this can be a nice way to start forming that relationship between them. You're gonna, if they have a howdy situation, you're going to have some idea of who's dominant and who's subordinate based on how they react with each other through a barrier. And then you can implement cooperative feeding even when there's a barrier between them. So what you'll see is first starting off with the door closed and then the door opens up. So the dominant male is on the other side on the right. And some of you may have heard me mention this project with the drills. This was at the LA Zoo, and the idea was this group of drills, critically endangered primate, they don't breed that well in captivity. This group of animals live together but sort of all occupied their own little corner in the enclosure. So they each occupied their own little spot in the enclosure. They didn't really affiliate. They didn't really aggress very much. They just didn't interact with each other at all. So the idea was to try to train them for all kinds of social interactions. So cooperative feeding was one part of that, and I'll show you some more in a sec. All right, same thing with some elephants. Dominant animals on your left, subordinates on the right. There is a barrier between them, but the door, which is this part back here, is actually open, so they can go back and forth, but it just made the subordinate feel a little bit more comfortable to be on the other side of the wall. So the subordinate's getting bits of produce, the dominant on the left is getting a grain that she really likes a lot, so she's getting much higher value food. So the reason that that last one was better, in the one right before, we threw the piece of food on the ground and then bridged and reinforced Debbie, the dominant. But on the last one, actually put the food in her trunk, which is something that these elephants really like. So that's kind of raising the value, if you will, is when you actually hand feed it, put it in the trunk. So that was like, oh, really good girl, Debbie, you let that happen too. So not only did you let Ronnie get the food, but you let me hand feed it to her. Okay, using targets to kind of help with your cooperative feeding. This lovely trainer, she's awesome, but she had just moved to working with the giraffe, and she thought there is no way I can ever feed this subordinate giraffe on the left because the male's super dominant, then that female in the middle is really pushy. So we were able to work with the giraffe simply by, or to do cooperative feeding simply by targeting the male away so that his face wasn't all in her business, because again, she's working alone. So we needed to get his face away a little bit. He can still see what's happening. She can give the subordinate a bit of food and then bridge and reinforce him for targeting and letting that happen. She was pretty excited. She's like, there's no way I'm ever gonna feed whatever her name is on the left. So really simple technique that made it a lot easier to deliver that food. So anyway, in summary, some general guidelines and things that you want to think about when you're implementing cooperative feeding. Go ahead and somehow first get control, if you will, direct the dominant animal, teach them to sit and stay, have them go to a target, give them some point of reference so they can come to that point, get reinforced for coming up and being cooperative. And then you're going to choose what your starting point will be, if you're going to use multiple people, if you're going to use big distance, or if one person can manage everybody in the social group. So you kind of have to determine what your starting point is. Think about if you have any enclosure features that'll help. Or like with Lulu, the chimpanzee that was on the other side of the blue barrel, that really helped her. I mean, she certainly knew Midge was getting training time and interaction and food, but that blue barrel really helped her stay on, in her spot. And it also made it really easy for the trainer, because if you think about Pug, the dominant male chimpanzee who was doing the scooting, if you have somebody in a smaller space and they start scooting or inching towards the subordinate, that could really threaten the subordinate and undermine your cooperative feeding efforts. Typically, when we want to start bringing animals closer together, it's usually more successful, of course not always, but usually more successful to start off by bringing the subordinate closer to the dominant, because we found that if you bring the dominant closer to the subordinate, that's too scary. So if the subordinate, or if the dominant is willing to sit and stay and allow the subordinate to move in, and the subordinate's feeling brave enough to take those steps with you, then that's a really good sign. And in the same light, if you're going to start off with multiple trainers, back the subordinate's trainers out first. That way the dominant never feels like he or she is getting left alone, because their person's with them all the time, just like you saw in the video. Okay, so looking at these two images, the male, the one on the right, is dominant over the female. So which situation do you think is better for setting up cooperative feeding? And why? And if you've already seen this video, or seen these pictures and answered this question, then...
Can you say again who's the dominant?
Dominant is the male on the right.
On the right.
They're both in the same space, right?
Yes. And if you can't tell, the wall, it comes across, and then there's a U-shaped area, and then it goes back. So this part is the U-shaped area, and then these two walls go off that way.
Is it one keeper or two?
Two. They're in the blue shirts.
Oh, I see them now.
Yeah.
I thought
It's
I
really easy to see from up here.
I can't quite tell, but wherever the male can see or the dominant can see the subordinate better. I can't tell which one it is. It's hard to tell from this.
What do you think about, think about exhibit features and making the subordinate feel safe?
Do you want me to think? It looks like in the lower picture, she actually kind of has an escape there off to the side, so she's actually more towards the corner, so she could get away if she needed to, versus the top one where the subordinate is face first into the gate, so her escapes are limited and the male can corner her.
Yeah. Yeah, she's in the top one, she's in that U-shaped area, and he's outside of it. So she's kind of trapped. In the lower one, he's more in the U-shaped area, and she's heading out. So we want to make the subordinate feel safe, because if the subordinate feels trapped or isn't comfortable, then they're always going to be on edge, which might then make the dominant like, ooh, I'm going to come get you. Okay, so just think about really making that subordinate animal feel as safe as possible. Okay, then the next technique that I want to talk about is gentle touch and proximity training, and I am almost done. I know we're supposed to stop. We stop at 2, right? Yeah. Okay. So gentle touch and proximity training involves using things like targets to teach animals to touch each other and to get closer together, and that can lead to things like grooming and reproductive behaviors. And we also reinforce the concept of touching someone or something gently, which can be used for introductions. You know, you say gentle, oh, okay, I'll touch you nicely, instead of coming at you hard and fast. So you can teach that concept of gentle. And of course, a gentle approach is less likely to provoke chasing and aggression. And this was that group of drills that I talked about earlier. So a study was done in 1987, a long time ago, and it looked at behavioral changes in this group of drills. So as I mentioned, prior to training, there was really very little interaction at all. There wasn't much aggression, but there was hardly any affiliation, no grooming, certainly no reproductive behaviors. And the idea was to try to see if these guys could ever reproduce. Unfortunately, the training never led to full reproduction, but all of their social behaviors, both aggression and affiliative behaviors, increased. But the aggression didn't increase outside the scope of what would be considered normal. And the really important part about this, it was the first time that the technique had been, systematically studied and demonstrated that the socialization training persisted beyond the time of training. I mean, obviously, if I'm saying, oh, go touch her and y'all be friends, and I'm reinforcing you for all that, if you're reasonably good at the training, it's going to happen in the moment of the training. But our hope is we walk away, you all still get along because you've had these more positive experiences together. And that's what the study demonstrated, was indeed their behavior did actually change and they began to socialize more. So this is the beginning of teaching Sammy, the male, to touch the female. Oops. So it's basically just targeting. She's taught to turn around as if presenting for breeding, and then his trainer is simply targeting him closer and closer to touching her. And in this group of drills, there were 2 situations with 2 different females. One was very afraid of him and would always run away whenever he would approach. The other one was aggressive to him. So he was kind of frustrated on all levels. He wasn't able to get close to any of the ladies. And this is once the behavior has been trained. So he's told to go touch. And you'll see in a minute her trainer's going to position her so that she's kind of presenting to him. That's a good one. So cute. Then he gets mad at the keeper. That's fine, get mad at us.
How do you go about transferring the touch to an object from an object to the other animal?
So here, I'll show you.
Okay.
This next example.
Wow.
So I kind of briefly mentioned some animals that are hyper-affiliative. This is more a condition of lab monkeys when they're perhaps not parent-raised, raised by people, raised in a deprived situation. Sometimes they'll be hyper-affiliators. They call it together monkeys, where they're hugging each other all of the time. It's too much hugging. So in this group of animals, there were ones that were hyper-affiliators, and then there were ones that didn't affiliate very much. So the ones that always wanted to hug were taught to like sit and stay with their hands in their pockets, and the ones who didn't ever touch anybody were taught to touch. So you'll see, I hope this might answer your question, you'll see just a PVC target in use, and you'll see that she's going to put the target on the animal who needs to be touched, thereby directing the one who needs to touch to the one getting touched. So see if this answers your question. If not, we can talk more about it. So first she's got to station the rest of the group members and kind of get them out of the way, and then the focus animals will be the ones down here. Okay, so this is the focus group. This one that she's targeting right now is the one that's been trained to touch. And the one on the left is the one that needs to not touch. Okay, so there's the kind of finished product, is it's been converted to just a hand signal and verbal. And now you'll see the target just for demonstration purposes. One click is good. Okay, so first, just like the Sammy was taught to target somebody's hand, target, right up to whichever female that was, Nadine's backside or hip, that targeting happens. So with the macaques, the same thing with the long PVC target, learn to touch the target, and then I begin to put that target on to the one that you want touched. A laser pointer is also, if your facility allows you to use a laser pointer, in other words, it's not too bright, you're not outside, you have mesh that you can easily get a laser pointer through. A laser pointer is actually really a much easier way because it gives you more distance that you can work to direct touching. We did this here with Ash and Donna. So you see Ash is on, the sun was super bright. Ash is on the other side of the gate. And this was just really early on when Donna was comfortable enough to stand there and let him begin touching her. A little bit later in the training, he's doing a little more touching, actually starting to lay his trunk more over her back. And part of the problem that, there's nobody from Elephants here, is there? No, I wish Jane was here. But part of the problem with what we saw with this is Ash became so focused on the training part of it that he was like, okay, I touched her, now give me my treat. And so we weren't getting the extended kind of groping touches that we wanted. And so in a little bit we had to like touch and then kind of stand back and then reinforce him wait a little bit to reinforce and try to get a little bit more duration of him touching. But the females had to be reinforced because they were pretty nervous just standing there while he comes over the fence and puts his big head and trunk over the top of them. Okay, last technique I'm just going to mention is called collaborative training. Whoops. And this involves teaching animals to work together towards a common goal, and then their collaborative efforts are reinforced. So this kind of was born of this notion of, when you send a bunch of marine mammals, cetaceans, whatever, whales and dolphins out, you say, go jump, and they all go and do this lovely battle where they jump together in a group. And a friend of mine who had worked in ocean parks for a long time made the comment, we were just talking about social behavior, and he made the comment of, oh yeah, we had these dolphins and we took them out of the feeder pool and put them in the show pool, and they weren't really friends in the feeder pool, but then when we started training them together, they seemed to form a really tight bond. And so it kind of got us thinking, like, could we purposefully set out to create tasks that animals have to do together and thereby strengthen their social bonds. So, again, you send the animals out, there's 2 whales and 2 dolphins, I think. Should be 4 animals jumping together, 1 jumps behind. What you want to see is this, where everybody goes together. And so in the first example, there were 3 and then 1 came along behind. If we said, oh, well, gee, they all jumped and the 3 of them did it together, so we're going to go ahead and bridge and reinforce them. We don't know 100% of what we're reinforcing. Maybe it's the jump. Maybe the one was just lazy and lagged behind, didn't get a good takeoff. Maybe underwater somebody went, don't jump next to me. And so if we reinforce everybody because, it seems like they tried, but somebody snarled at somebody else, we may have just reinforced some aggression or displacement. So that's why it's really important that you pay attention to the whole group and reinforce everybody going together. In this case, we were trying to use this technique to get 2 fat little girl elephants to run. Really, the keepers got more exercise than the elephants, but the idea was, come on girls, if you're both running, it'll be more fun and you're both going to get reinforced. The keepers run along, the elephants are like, yeah. So that was kind of not a great effort. But there they get a little speed going. But certainly now there's a lot of experiments that have been done looking at setting up situations where animals have to do things together, like the elephants they both have to pull the bar together. Same thing with the chimps, neither one of them can do the task by themselves, so they have to work together to pull in this object or to achieve whatever the goal is. So you could have something like this where their collaborative efforts would be reinforced. It could be something like, I pick this up and hand it to you, and then you take it and hand it to her, and when we all 3 work together towards this behavior, don't make long distance calls. When we all 3 work together on this behavior, then our efforts are reinforced. So it's kind of a different approach to, and a different way of thinking about reinforcing collaborative efforts and partnering. It's different than cooperative feeding because you're setting up a situation where we must work together to be rewarded. And I think it's, there is some experiments that are going on now and looking at the economics of giving animals different types of food and how much they want to have the same equal value things, if there's jealousy, if they can learn to work together. And really when we started talking about this collaborative training, I think it was before a lot of this experimenting was really getting more popular, where things like this were being looked at. And we're seeing that, yeah, indeed, animals are watching what each other are getting, and this is important to them. So it makes sense that if we could teach them to work together, that they might learn that it's, that their bonds would strengthen and that it would solidify cooperation, different to cooperative feeding, that's, kind of solidify them cooperating and working together towards that common goal. Okay, that's all. Yeah. So, it's about 2:05. I'm sorry I did go a little bit over, probably because I gave you too much background information. But questions?
I have a thought about the chimps. What was his name? Yes. Pug, and you mentioned that you think he stayed dominant for a point. his entire life, which is interesting to me. Do you think the cooperative feeding with everyone being calm and everyone being comfortable in their positions, do you think that potentially helped him stay dominant? Because
He was moved to different groups,
Okay.
so his groups were changed. I think one of the males that was with him stayed with him. They were buddies, they stayed together, but other group members changed. The enclosures where they were changed, they were different types of enclosures, but he was always a very dominant individual. That was kind of his personality. But the cooperative feeding may have helped make him a nicer dominant going into different groups.
It just made me wonder if the whole group, like this group training, the whole group is being calm and reinforced for having this one animal as the dominant, maybe others would be like less likely to challenge, and then you have less dramas.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like the cooperative feeding, the socialization shouldn't change somebody's position in the hierarchy.
But would it help maintain it? Is I think my question.
Yeah, I don't know, that's a good question. We can test it.
Because it could be reinforcing that there's not constant fights right now. Be like, okay, Myra, you're gonna be dominant, you get an extra quarter of an apple, alright, that's fine. I'm not gonna try to displace you because I'm happy with what I'm getting and where everything is, so why?
It doesn't sound very sure.
It doesn't sound very similar. And I think next we have our meeting.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
My question is going to be, are we still having the meeting? Take minutes, yeah.
Where are we meeting?
In Valerie and Erica's office.
To the left.
Something?
He's alive, but barely.
Oh, you know what, I think.
Next step is
That's all it's gonna be,
potentially
yeah.
surgery.
Never mind.
I think Ashley's up there now, so.
Amber,
Yes.
so your scale is potentially almost ready.
Cool.
He asked if he could bring it by today, but he's still not sure when it's gonna be done. I'm like, it's getting a little late, can we wait until tomorrow?
Yeah.
Alright.
Yeah, I have accepted that I might not have skill for a while. Go ahead.
Amber?
Are you going to the city?
Yes.
Okay, Poppy, I just wanted to let someone know I won't be able to make it.
Happy, thanks for the heads up. Gonna stop recording now.